In the aftermath of World War II, the world was left in ruins, but the stage was set for a new conflict. The war that followed wasn't fought with guns and bombs, but with ideologies, espionage, and proxy battles across the globe. This was the Cold War, a standoff between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. A conflict that would shape the second half of the 20th century and leave a lasting impact on the world. This documentary delves deep into the events, ideologies, and key moments that defined the Cold War, a period marked by fear, tension, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. From the origins of the conflict to its global ramifications, we'll explore how this battle between superpowers shaped the modern world. The Cold War's roots lie in the uneasy alliance between the US and the Soviet Union during World War II. Despite fighting a common enemy, their visions for the post-war world couldn't have been more different. At the Yalta and Potsdam Conferences, the cracks began to show. The US envisioned a world of free markets and democratic governments, while the Soviet Union sought to expand its influence and protect its borders with a buffer of socialist states. The division of Europe was solidified as the Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, establishing communist governments across the region. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia became Soviet satellites, further deepening the divide between East and West. The US responded with the Truman Doctrine in 1947, pledging to contain the spread of communism worldwide. This marked the beginning of a global struggle for influence. The Berlin Blockade of 1948-49 was one of the first major crises of the Cold War. In an attempt to force the Western Allies out of Berlin, Stalin cut off all land access to the city. The US and its allies responded with the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation that delivered food and supplies to the isolated city for nearly a year. The blockade was lifted, but Berlin remained a flashpoint in the Cold War for decades to come. The arms race was one of the most terrifying aspects of the Cold War. Both the US and the Soviet Union poured vast resources into developing nuclear weapons, each side striving to outdo the other. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, ending the US monopoly on nuclear weapons. This sparked an arms race that would escalate throughout the 1950s and 60s. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, in the 1950s meant that both superpowers now had the capability to launch a nuclear strike anywhere in the world. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, became the grim reality. If one side launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate, ensuring total annihilation. The world lived in the shadow of a potential nuclear holocaust. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of the US, brought the world to the brink. For 13 days, the world held its breath as President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev engaged in a tense standoff. A peaceful resolution was reached, with the Soviets agreeing to remove the missiles in exchange for a US promise not to invade Cuba, and the secret removal of US missiles from Turkey. The crisis highlighted the dangers of the arms race and led to efforts to establish more direct communication between the two superpowers. The Cuban Missile Crisis underscored the need for arms control. In 1968, the US, Soviet Union, and other major powers signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, aimed at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons and promoting peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Despite these efforts, the arms race continued, with both sides developing even more powerful weapons and delivery systems. While the superpowers avoided direct conflict, they engaged in numerous proxy wars around the globe. The Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, was one of the first major conflicts of the Cold War, with the US and its allies supporting South Korea against the Soviet-backed North. The war ended in a stalemate, with Korea remaining divided to this day. The Vietnam War, from 1955 to 1975, was perhaps the most infamous of the Cold War proxy wars. The US intervened to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, but the war became a quagmire, leading to a deeply divided American public, and eventually to the withdrawal of US forces. The fall of Saigon in 1975 marked the end of the war and a significant defeat for US foreign policy. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union found itself embroiled in a quagmire of its own in Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion in 1979 was intended to support the communist government against insurgent groups, but it sparked a brutal decade-long conflict. The US, along with other countries, supported the Afghan Mujahideen, providing them with weapons and training. The war drained Soviet resources and contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. The Cold War also played out in a series of revolutions, uprisings, and civil wars across the developing world. In Latin America, Africa, and Asia, the US and Soviet Union supported opposing sides, often with devastating consequences. Countries like Cuba, Angola, and Nicaragua became battlegrounds in the global struggle between capitalism and communism. The Cold War wasn't just a military conflict, it was also a battle for hearts and minds. Both superpowers engaged in extensive propaganda campaigns to win over global public opinion. The US promoted its values of freedom and democracy through outlets like Voice of America, while the Soviet Union used state-controlled media to spread its message of socialist solidarity. The cultural and ideological battle was as fierce as the military one, with each side seeking to prove the superiority of its way of life. The Cold War also reached into the heavens, with the US and Soviet Union competing in the space race. The Soviets struck first with the launch of Sputnik in 1957, the world's first artificial satellite. This achievement sent shockwaves through the US, leading to a renewed focus on science and technology education. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, further intensifying the competition. President John F. Kennedy responded with an ambitious goal to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. This led to the Apollo program, a massive effort that culminated in the historic moon landing of 1969. The moon landing was more than just a technological achievement, it was a victory in the ideological battle of the Cold War. The US had proven that its system could achieve the impossible, landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. The space race was a key front in the Cold War, showcasing the technological prowess and ambition of both superpowers. By the 1970s, the dangers of the Cold War had become clear, and both sides sought to reduce tensions. This period, known as détente, saw a series of arms control agreements, including the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, and diplomatic breakthroughs like President Nixon's visit to China. These efforts were aimed at easing the tensions between the superpowers and reducing the risk of nuclear war. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 marked a significant moment in the Cold War, as the US, Soviet Union, and 33 other nations agreed to respect the borders of Europe and to uphold human rights. This agreement, while not ending the Cold War, represented a step towards a more stable and peaceful world order. In the 1980s, the Cold War entered its final phase. President Reagan initially took a hardline stance against the Soviet Union, famously calling it the evil empire. However, he also engaged in significant diplomatic efforts with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who sought to reform the Soviet system through policies of glasnost or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. These reforms ultimately led to the loosening of Soviet control over Eastern Europe. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the end of the Cold War. It was followed by a wave of peaceful revolutions across Eastern Europe, as communist regimes collapsed and the people demanded greater freedom. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, marking the end of a nearly 50-year standoff. The world had changed, and the Cold War was over. The Cold War shaped the modern world in ways that are still felt today. It was a conflict that never erupted into full-scale war, but its effects were profound, influencing global politics, economics, and culture. The world that emerged from the Cold War is one where the US stands as the sole superpower, but the echoes of that era remain, reminding us of the dangers of ideological conflict and the importance of diplomacy. Even today, the legacy of the Cold War is evident in the relationship between Russia and the West. The mistrust, competition, and occasional cooperation are remnants of a time when the world was divided along ideological lines. The Cold War reminds us of the fragility of peace and the importance of dialogue and understanding in a world still marked by divisions. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. The Cold War was a time of great peril, but also of incredible resilience. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, humanity can find a way forward.